I would first of all like to say thank you to everyone that is here, and I am extremely honored and proud to be here with Precious. And of course, the hand is in everything we do. So even for us to be here, to travel, to be together, we're using this hand to write, to draw, to think. And so for me, thinking, if we have to look at human beings, we as a force, we thinking that we are stronger and smarter than every other thing. We think we can conquer the world in different ways. And the hand is that thing that manages to come out there and shift mountains, shift things. And so for me, I'm very much interested in how, from this part here, how that then translates into this, and then how that also enters into automated machines, and how we translate the hand, which is no more the human hand, but the hand that enters into automation, the hand that enters into the making. So we had a long time in our lives where we as human thought we were the bigger, stronger party, and we're seeing more and more that that hand becomes also the thing that has learned from us how to move, and then it becomes this machine that is then automated. So in the work, I'm interested in many ways in which bodies, not just the human body, but all other kinds of bodies, are finding their place within this maneuvering. And I love the French word, de manœuvrer. And if you think of that, etymology of that word is really the to the hand that moves, le main, the hand that maneuver, the œuvre, the hand and the œuvre and the work. So it's this two parts of it that I find really interesting and also extremely performative. So when working through a landscape like in Namibia, and then you're seeing that a whole mountain can be cut through to be able to allow the railroads to pass. And I'm talking about mountains that are about, I don't know, like, I don't know, very high. And you're cutting through that to be able to allow a train track to pass through. Then you then realize the kind of power that hand has and the performativity of that. And also as a single person or as a group or as a nation state or as a corporation, or so you start seeing that hand working through different systems, subterranean systems, as systems that are above. And that's why I find it super interesting in relation to the work, your work, Precious, in relation to that.
Yeah, I think my daily practice is more of like a praxis of a type of non-coercive rearrangement on the way to form a new language, which I think a lot of the things I'm constantly thinking about, like one of my favorite books is this Heidegger's On the Way to Language, which is how I'm like always thinking of my practice kind of like on the way to something that I'm finding out the language for as I go through the many forms of it. So rather it be like the poetry, which is where my seeds started, with my mom being like, if you have a dream or you have something you want to have come true, you have to write it down and plant it in the ground. And she actually literally meant that. So as a kid, I would like write down all these things and like dig up little things in our backyard and plant. So I had this kind of like little poetry garden in our backyard for a long time. And I think about that through how I even make gardens now. It's like sowing seeds of community, of like care, and which is a form of my practice and praxis of like literally I think of it as non-coercive rearrangement of holding on to people, whether it be in space, through breath, with food, with language. It's all entangled in that, and it's on the way to something. Usually not sure what it is.
My interest with material was actually my interest with space. And this is in Bruges, here in Belgium, the 12th century hospital, which a hospital, we call it a hospital today, but the way hospitals were seen in that time wasn't really hospital. There were places of respite, places of regeneration, and places where you could rest after a long journey and pilgrimage. And so we have a different, completely different notion of what the space is and how we consider hospitals today. But what I was very much interested was how the structure was built. And when you look at it, you have the wood, which is very old wood sitting on the stone base and foundation. And when you're looking at very much the histories or the let's say old buildings that were made from different times, you're seeing that a lot of the wood, a lot of the structures are actually sitting on stone. And if we think of Manhattan or New York, it's sitting on glacier stone. So it's which is to be able to build those skyscrapers, you need those kinds of really hard stones that have been formed over time. So you're understanding the way of building, the way of thinking in relation to the work. And I wanted that emphasis of material that you would have the wood, you would have the stone, you would actually call on these elements that are within the space, and you explode and expand it within the space, in which people start then looking at the architecture and also looking at the space itself, but also connecting it to the histories, the painting of Beer Block to Hans Memling, to the anonymous painter and the painting of the Good Samaritan. And you're kind of connecting these histories, but looking at it through the ways in which we relate to material, to space, and to each other. And that was the kind of building block for the whole exhibition in Bruges. Being in Bolzano at that point in time, I'm just thinking of the notion of fluids, bodies, and how being in a landscape that felt like you could walk through, people going mountain climbing. It felt really, the air felt pure and amazing, and people would actually go out there to go for walks and climb the mountains. But around that area, you would have Bolzano is one of those places where you'd have the biggest amount of apples being produced. And that means a lot of pesticides, a lot of spray fertilizers, and so you would have all these greens, but those greens are kind of deceptive. And so I started thinking about what it meant to be able to walk through the space and how all this non-tangible, invisible particles slowly entering my veins. And what does that mean? And how do you translate that from a thought, an emotion, a fear, something that is actually so invisible, but is actually transforming my body in the long term? And and so it's always a very difficult thing to translate what you're going through and feeling, but at the same time, you don't feel it enough to know that something is happening, but you know that something is happening. You know that there's a chemical formula that is entering and interacting with the kinds of formulas and blood and vessels and liquids in the body, but you don't know what it's going to do. And so I was thinking, well, why not make this vein? But this vein, not only about my own body, but if we think of the river also had this light, clear blue water going through as you're driving from Verona to, or walking, moving from Verona to Bolzano, you're constantly meeting the stream that is moving. And I'm just imagining all these particles being part of it and flowing through it. And then being in Bolzano, I decided to make this work that would be the size of the room I was showing in. And for Venice, it made sense to be able to show this work in which it also divides the space and creates this kind of veins. And the marble, I chose a marble piece that already had veins in it. So when you talk about stones or you talk about marble or things like that, people are looking at the veins that cut through. So the purest marble is a marble without any veins, no color, it's just the white Carrara marble. And I got this marble from the Lhasa marble, which is close to I went to the quarries and then chose the stone, and this one had a green vein that passed through it. So I was interested in all this multi layers of thinking of veins, the veins in the body, enlarging it, the veins, the water that passes through the landscape, the veins in the stone, so it was a condensation of thinking of layers that are going through this kind of idea of contamination. But the last step of it was also to think of Bolzano as a place where the also the notion of ideologies and how certain ideologies that are non-tangible kind of filtrate through the air and then enters into our psychic and our psychological way of thinking, and that how that becomes a vein in the society. So there are many layers of it, but it ends up being an abstract form of all these layers.
I don't think I see humanity as separate from nature, and I have always seen that as entangled. I feel like that kind of is one of our biggest hurdles of thinking ourselves separate from the world when we live in a world with so many different worlds. I mean, thank goodness, like all of the tiny multiplicities of like so many realities that we share on this planet with so many different ecosystems. And that just teaches us, of course, we would be in relation to breath with them. Everything that moves the world also moves us. So there is no, there's no distinction. I mean, that's one of the joys for me of making installations. It's like, how can I be moved by this space, but also how can it move me, and am I broken apart in that? Within these ecosystems I make, a lot of the time I don't have like much control once I've planted. Especially when I work with invasive plants, a lot of the joy of that is just getting to see what happens and the miracle of like not knowing.
I would like to talk about the relationship of thinking about spaces and that relationship in understanding also the functioning of the world, in the sense that whatever you're taking out is something that is a whole. So even if you're taking out a plant, it's a little hole you've created within that space. And then you take that plant and you eat it, which becomes another a nutrient. And then at the same time, you're the nutrient, and then it kind of gives a positive into the body. So we're constantly dealing with this spaces of like the hollowing out, the replenishment, and it's a constant thing that it from that plant we get the energy, from that energy we excrete out again, and then it kind of gives energy to another thing, and then so it's a kind of buildup of this removal, replenishment, and I'm interested in those kind of like movements in which it helps us understand the kind of planet we're living in. So when we're designing a planet that is only extracting from a place and taking out without thinking about how to refill those places of emptiness, from like mines to like places where labor is extracted at an exponential rate, to a place where trees are being cut down at an exponential rate, and to the place where soil is being polluted in, or water bodies are being polluted up to a certain rate, without thinking about how that, and those are the negative spaces. Those are the places where we're not thinking about how to replenish. And I'm interested in those kinds of forms of understanding those cycles. So for the work of Shaja, that relationship to groundwater, and groundwater which has been extracted out at a fast rate, which doesn't allow it to replenish, into the salt water from the sea taking over the groundwater. So when you take water out of the wells, they become this hollow, empty spaces of salt water. And so that was the starting place of understanding that relationship to water, that relationship to the salt water, the groundwater, how it affects a place, the economy of a place. But here I decided to make a work that um, talks about addiction. And so the tree that is there and different things are actually singing about the addictions that they have to salt water and how it's killed them slowly. But I think that relationship to holes cannot be we cannot think of it just as negative, but we have to also think of the positive. The amount of buildings that we build, or skyscrapers in New York, Dubai, Shanghai, we also have to imagine the amount of salt, silicates and sand that we've taken out of the earth, and how does that balance out. So for me, I'm interested in those. That's why mineral is important. That's why it's important to understand what it's doing in the world and the disbalances that is happening, but at the same time, what it's creating in a positive way in other places.
I'm obsessed with archiving and memory and collective unconscious. I think I have a deep rooted desire to investigate people, things, places, time. I like to burrow down and like get to know a person. So when I was thinking about how do I how do I like take this fantasy of like I was like, what do I do? And the only thing I could think of doing was investigating existentially. So I asked everyone the same 10 questions, and I did Lacanian psychoanalysis on strangers. Um, and the only thing that could come out of that was radical vulnerability and a sense of disarming honesty. And with that, I collected it and made a frequency that is my radio tower that kind of beams out the transmission of all the answers. The questions are, who caused the suffering of your mother? How are you preparing for your death? Um, Describe a morning you woke up without fear. You know, they're quite vulnerable questions that I'm asking you to soften a little bit with me. So the interviews lasted for about like, my longest one was 2.5 hours. My shortest one was 30 minutes. And I interviewed over 80 people over the course of 2 weeks. And it kind of was this very special moment that I like to say my time outside of time, which was the only gift I could give people in that moment, was how do I allow you this space that no one usually gives you access to, which is usually just a little bit of time to soften. And with that, I was able to locate people's memories, their pain, a type of frequency that allowed for a new form of dreaming and imagination, because it, it I just really wanted to know where everybody was at, and what they were holding, and from that is and the thing with the radio tower is that the frequency changes every month. So some months, because it's over like 50 hours of audio, so it's a new station every month, which breeds for a very unique song that gets to exist. It's a bunch of weeds that I found that I know from like growing around Lagos, which is like wild asparagus that kind of grows in very funny places. And there's jasmine, which is something that has weirdly like popped up around like Victoria Island everywhere. Like people like planting this very like ornamental jasmine, which like doesn't really fit in, but it kind of works as this weed and it ensnakes with the wild asparagus. And it was just something very interesting that I like. And then on the edges of the garden, I planted all this datura because it's one of my favorite flowers. And encasing all this kind of like wild garden is all this like little secret poison that's like creeping up. So it's interesting how this garden will end up in like 5 more months. This piece, When the Lambs Rise Up Against the Bird of Prey, is a text that my dear friend Anne Boyer wrote, who is a very special person to me, and poetry kind of forms my whole practice. I say I'm a poet before I'm an artist always, because it's the thing that formed me. And Anne wrote this very special text. I found it very many years ago, and then she wrote a follow-up poem for me that kind of inspired the show, that is the text of the lamb, which is that the lamb is a vulnerable creature, but there is power in the flock. They speak a special language. They know how to protect themselves against the bird of prey. So I thought, I was thinking through a lot of things. I was thinking through Scriabin's Mysterium. So this piece is kind of, I'm obsessed with this composer, Scriabin, who spent kind of like 20 years of his life trying to write this unfinished piece, Mysterium, that he believed once he did this 10-day performance of it, the world would end in the Himalayan mountains. He got very close. He got his island. He didn't succeed. He dies. So I was like, I'm rewriting Mysterium with the amazing composer Arturo. We go, we do this, and I rewrite the first three liberatos, and that's what plays inside of this hollow mountain, inside of the park. And you walk in, and it's a it's a dead garden essentially. It's a garden that's after the end of the world. You're thinking all of the plants in there, these fig trees that are slowly blooming. I have all of these small mosses, and then again, there's poison. There's the slow things that are rotting, like the bleeding hearts. I have stinging nettles everywhere. Datura pops up again, and then there are ferns. And inside of the garden is this lamb, and she's there, and she's watching and waiting. She seems to just be observing. She makes eye contact with you and then goes back into her state. And the garden itself kind of like slowly blooms and like dies and rots over the course of, it was about 2.5 months. But you could walk through and eat the figs, and then you would see the like little ecosystem crumbling. So it was really thinking through like after the end, like what are these slow rotting growing things. It's a plan I have a very deep memory of. Once again, always thinking through archives. It's something that I grew up in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati is very close to Kentucky, and it's weirdly a plant that's found its way over there too. So it's something that I would see very much growing up in the forest, and it's something that is very magical when you come in contact with it, about its ability to swallow an area. And I have a certain soft spot for invasives, for things that are resilient to places that they're put in. And I mean, specifically in the US, kudzu's done this thing where it goes being brought over to be this like miracle plant that then was supposed to magically fix no topsoil existing. It did its job, which it very planted itself very deep in the root beds of things. And like, if you were to take it away now today, it would basically crumble the soil. Like, it can't exist, which I mean is very imperative of how I like then see this likeness to like Black life in the U.S. And then you have it, it's so criminalized to grow now, it's people don't know how to deal with it, but then you see it in its native land in Japan, you're like, oh, there's a whole integral system of working with this plant, you eat it, so it's a different idea and knowledge of like how things are pollinated and what the space is, and also the community and culture of dealing with things. And I find the beauty of like, for me, making a space where this plant can thrive, and also working with its other invasive counterpart, sugarcane, which also has a very interesting history. So we're having these two things like grow and pollinate together, and then slowly like take over to having a space just for themselves was like itself a miracle. And then once again in S.M.A.K, doing this specific piece during COVID where for months nobody was allowed to enter this space. So it was a kudzu garden where nobody could go inside except for the museum workers that got to water it every day and take care of it. It slowly swallowed the space inside of this like dream-like quality. I remember I did this reading there where it was COVID time, so none of my friends could come. So we just recorded these audios and read poetry to the plants. So it was kind of this moment of being like, oh, what does it mean to make a space for a thing that's not supposed to exist to thrive and to beyond thrive, but to just be there for itself, watching and waiting, time outside of time. So what I found in Venice that was so special was that like it actually for me, like once you got to the end of the exhibition, you were exhausted. It allowed for this like fragility of time, for a slowness. And like in this space, there were these black butterflies that I bred, specifically these black swallowtails that I love very much. And the piece is called "The Sky Is Always Black" Fort Moose, about how freedom is constant flight, but all of them kind of bred and like were born inside of this space and would fly, and you would like have one occasionally like land on you inside of this like slow ecosystem of like death and pollination. And my friend, I work with musicians a lot, which is a really big, because once again, I like my practice isn't independent of its own. It's work with musicians, poets, gardeners, because you don't make gardens alone. And the music here was this kind of like very eerie and haunting kind of really frightening. It sounded like an alarm, and it was just wind that me and Gio had collected over the course of like 2 years of knowing each other. Whenever we would hear wind that we couldn't live without, we would send it back and forth to each other, and that made this piece. So it's all small archives. I don't know.
I was interested in making an exhibition where there would be zero waste. That was it. And to think through that, especially in such a huge space, 4 floors, how can you make an exhibition thinking of the end life of the material? And that has been one of the guiding things of thinking about ways of working. How can this material go back into the soil or go back into every other aspects that it could become? So I could have a brilliant idea and it's killed by the material itself saying no way. So, um, so for Bregans, I was very curious about, and I've been very curious about how to see a tree in all its glory. And the funny thing was and again, knowing that we are in Austria, they have so many pine trees. And I was thinking, well, I'd love to see a whole tree and just to be able to walk around it, because the most I see when you walk in the forest, you only see the tree up to a certain level. That's where your eyes, your vision is. So I can imagine like a squirrel running up a tree, and the squirrel has so much information that I don't have. So sometimes I'm actually jealous of a squirrel. I see squirrels and I'm like, oh my God, you're so and they run away from me. But I'm just thinking of that squirrel running and he's found a spot. He's in a hole. And sometimes I wish to be a squirrel, but it doesn't happen. So I thought, well, if I have this opportunity to have this Peter Zoom tour building, 4 floors, well, I might as well bring in a tree. And then I could be that squirrel that climbs, each floor, and I see the tree in all its glory. And it was amazing because the tree was actually taller than the Bregenz building. The tree was like 44 meters, like the Bregenz building is 44 meters high. This tree was bigger than Bregenz. I was like, how could that be? So, well, we managed to bring this tree and slant it, because if you put it this way, it would never be that long. So we slanted it so we could have all the different layers of the tree. And the great thing was like, the guy that I got it from his forest, he has a huge forest. He was like, I found you this tree, which is dying. And I was like, yeah, but the tree's looking alive. It's like, don't worry, it's dying. There's a mistletoe at one point in time, and this little mistletoe slowly strangles this tree and kills it. And this is a 100-year-old tree. So when walking it, I could just look at this tree and see all the moss, the lichens, all the, like its wrinkles. It's like, and for the first time, I can actually say I was a squirrel.
And what was so special about the show was that all the trees get replanted every time I make a tree work. You have to plant the tree and then you have to get another tree and plant that other tree, which is one of my favorite things about this work is like you just get to plant endless trees. And um, this piece was really special to me because I made this fig. It's a it's at the Luma Westbow, which is in this black box. Basically, it's a black library, and it's you have the fig trees, and then you have two pear trees behind, and then it rains these cotton seeds through the AC vents all day. And then you have these little lanterns, and in the trees are my angels, these kind of like little stuffed animals with bird wings that are lynched from the trees, and the cotton blows everywhere. And then throughout the show, the trees, because they're in unrooted soil, they are forced to blossom. So you have these forced figs that bloom, and then towards the end of the show, you replant them again, and they kind of like settle into their rooting. I went around Zurich looking for where I wanted them to be repotted, and having this like kind of the special thing about this piece was that when these trees came, they had all of these mushroom spores I didn't know about that were inside of the like pot. So then these mushrooms popped out magically throughout like one and a month into the show that I was like, where did this come from? So it was in this slow rot, death, and then the miracle pops up. So that's kind of always it for me is that's the optimism of the thing that you just don't know what's going to happen.
The amount of Africans that were thrown out at sea and dropped in the sea that died, that on the silent bed, which we call the water, the sea itself, we can imagine all that distance into the Americas and the Caribbeans. We are mineral, we are water, we are composed iron, copper, everything. We represent every single thing in its singular form in the world. And we can imagine now today that we're going to exploit the amount of nodules for electric cars. Centuries of bodies falling into the sea have created more minerals. So that means that as human beings, we have transformed into minerals, and those minerals are our futures. And the work here, Abyss, is talking about this dark place where nodules have fallen, where bodies have fallen and become nodules, in which the pin takes out the energy that we're going to be using for the future. And it's thinking of that cycle in which the bodies, all organic matter becomes again mineral. All organic matter becomes again life, feeds our future. And that for me was very important to clarify. So it's not only about today and what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea, but it's about even what's happening in the Mediterranean Sea is futures, speculations that we don't know yet of. I think it deals with the way we communicate with other life forms which are gods. And if we considered, because Christianity did not tell me that a tree was God, it told me that some being up there is a God in which I have to look up to. And that completely transformed the way we negotiated our landscapes. Because if we believe that all these things are God's, how would we have designed our future? And for me, that's it. If you're thinking this is a God, a tree is a God, water is a God, this butterfly is a God, and and I have gratitude for it to exist, and it exists in a way that it makes me exist. Then you would, you know, that relationship to spirituality is not about religion. It has nothing to do with that. It's about your relationship to how you want your life and all other life forms to exist in coexistence in this future, for the present, and with the past. That's the way I see it. And prayers are part of that.
You got it. I mean, it's literally the entangled prayer. It's the entangled prayer. And I just hope that everything else leaks and like it's like, yeah, I'm present in my flesh, and with that I hope that everything I breathe and the spirit that forms between the relational like love between everyone I pollinate with, and then that makes the whole world. That's the world I want to live in, where I'm present in breath with everything around me.